Hello everyone, so today we're going to talk about the dead philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche, especially as interpreted by historians. I'm looking right now at a textbook called The Cultures of the West, History, edited or maybe even written by Clifford R. Bachman. And the reason I want to highlight a few passages in this historian's discussion of Nietzsche is that it also has parallels with how I was taught about Nietzsche in the context of like academic history, from a historian's perspective, not from the perspective of a professional philosopher. And without discounting the insight, and I think there's some good points and some interesting things to think about with respect to what these historians say. Later in the video, we'll look at some things that Nietzsche himself wrote, and I'll give a little bit of my opinion about what some of the key takeaways of Nietzsche's thought are, which are going to be different from what these historians talk about. So basically, the chapter where they talk about Nietzsche, and this is where Bachman talks about Nietzsche, this is a big volume that covers what is called just Western history. So it starts in like the ancient Near East. They cover that stuff briefly, Mesopotamia, Egypt. Then they move to like the Minoans and Mycenaeans. In ancient Greece, they probably talk about the ancient Hebrews. And then it goes, the story from classical Greece to medieval Europe to the Renaissance, Reformation, scientific revolution, the start of modernity. And then there's a lot more time that's paid attention to like the last couple centuries, with the rise of imperialism, industrialism, and then as we get to this chapter, modernism, and then we get into like the world wars and to the modern day. So the chapter where Nietzsche is mentioned is called From Nihilism to Modernism. And the way it contextualizes, before we actually get into Nietzsche, the historical moment here, and it's talking about like intellectual history, like sometimes historians distinguish between military history, political history, and intellectual history. It's been a while since I've really thought about that, but basically they're talking about relativity. So I'll read you this passage. The key figure here is Einstein, but as we'll see, they kind of see relativity as kind of this whole historical idea that goes beyond just the contributions into the field of physics of Albert Einstein. So here I'm quoting from the textbook. Einstein finished the task of reinventing physics in 1905 when he published what came to be known as his special theory of relativity. His general theory of relativity followed in 1915. They are difficult, but it's important to understand the basics, and not solely in order to appreciate the science. Relativity could in fact stand for the entire cultural and intellectual ferment of the early 20th century. It could stand for the relativity of aesthetic values, of philosophical terms, and of literary judgments. Artists and poets did not derive their ideas from Planck, who I'm assuming might be another scientist. It looks in the previous section like he was another physicist. Artists and poets did not derive their ideas from Planck and Einstein, although many were keenly aware of them. But there are parallels all the same. So basically, this idea of relativity that we're uncertain about the specifics of which judgments are which. This is understood as a entire feature of the intellectual texture of Europe in the early 20th century. I think it's, an interesting idea. I do want to note that, and they'll do this with Nietzsche as well, they are kind of glossing over the depths of these thinkers' ideas. They're saying, well, we can't really understand Einstein here because this is not a physics textbook. Bachman then proceeds to explain a few of the features of relativity, that if you throw a ball while you're on a train, I'm like kind of simplifying even what they're saying, but the ball is traveling at the speed that it's thrown. It's also traveling at the speed of the train. It's not certain which, or to be precise, it's traveling at both speeds, the speed of it being thrown and the speed of the train at the same time, depending on the observer. So it's relative to the subjective perspective. And to cartoonify it and oversimplify it, I don't think that this picture is actually this simplistic, but going into the following decades, even to today, there then becomes like this movement of anything is everything, truth is relative. There is, a postmodernist, ironic refusal to stick your foot in the ground and say that something is true or something is a certain way. And then going along with that is a conservative pushback that says, no, that's wrong. There is some absolute truth. I think that dichotomy is a little bit elementary and simplistic, but hey, when you're going to talk about all of Western history, even though those ideas I think are ultimately like not fully true or they don't fully represent the ideas at stake, it still paints a picture of the world we live in, and it helps tell us a story to understand where we're at. So again, it's kind of a cool insight. Then he brings Nietzsche into it, and I'll just read what he says about Nietzsche. So this might be a long quotation, but I just want to make sure that I'm not like misrepresenting these ideas. Quote, "Like physics, philosophy in the 20th century was insightful and brilliant. Like physics, too, it has often been exceedingly difficult to understand. Often, however, it has been depressing." So they're going to cartoonify Nietzsche into a depressing figure, which I think is like really, really badly wrong. He wrote an entire book called The Joyful Science, where he argued that we should be joyful. But you know what? That's not what I want to talk about exactly in this video. Anyway, philosophy is depressing, and that is not an unfortunate side effect. It is the work's very point. Okay, sure. Coming down from the heights of idealism, its thrust has been the randomness, contingency, and disorder of life. So that's that theme again of whatever, postmodernism flavored, anything is everything-ness. Modern philosophy has argued for the inability of our minds to comprehend reality and the slipperiness of language in trying to discuss it. It's not a pretty picture. Okay. So I guess that's really bad for us to not be able to discuss life with language. I don't know why that's a problem. Can't we just use language for communication and then acknowledge that truth is something that we encounter not through words, but through qualia, through sense information? Anyway, maybe let's not get into that. But anyway, then he goes to talk about the division between analytic and rationalist philosophers. So probably another oversimplification of philosophy. I'm kind of just going to skim that paragraph. So it's basically an overview of the analytic continental divide in the field of academic philosophy. But I keep forgetting this guy's name. Clifford R. Bachman then says that what analytic and continental philosophers share is, quote, a 19th century inheritance, a purposeless universe, and a view of human life that is, in the absence of a divine creator, without essential function or meaning. The key figure in the new bleakness was Friedrich Nietzsche, the prophet of God's death. Although little known in his lifetime, Nietzsche's work advanced the nihilistic philosophy of the age, even though he himself rejected the extreme skepticism known as nihilism. So they're saying Nietzsche's a bleak, nihilistic figure, but he does qualify that it's not necessarily Nietzsche's own views that were nihilistic. It's more his effect on history that were nihilistic, or as this broader chapter is arguing, relativistic, right? To Nietzsche, human life without God is tragically meaningless. Every individual's existence is a cold crack of light between two eternities of darkness, and nothing that happens during that brief crack matters in any absolute sense. We are simply random gatherings of molecules that cohere and experience consciousness for a short time before dissolving again into nothingness. Sounds like that was written by Carl Sagan, but anyway, not a very sunny view. Okay, so now he's going to quote Nietzsche. Quote, "Hope in a supposed reality is the greatest evil that can befall anyone," he writes, "for all it does is prolong one's agony." So, yeah, I don't know if if that quote in particular is what I would have picked to represent the thrust of Nietzsche's thought. Actually, I'll show you the quote from Nietzsche that I would pick. If we're going to try to characterize the vibe of Nietzsche's writing, just in one quotation. But I do get what he's saying. Whether Nietzsche intended it or not, whether he actually believed it himself or not, the reality is that he did question modernity. He did question Western ideas, Western philosophy. And, there's a disruptive, chaotic effect that had. And it led some people to see things in a bleak way. Fair enough. But Nietzsche's point, and here he's qualifying, is to rouse us to action, not to drive us to collapse and despair. This is exactly where he parts with the nihilists. We should not simply accept the world's randomness, but actually do something about it. So that's, I think, a fair representation of his thought. Let us not make the agony of our existence even worse by being stupid while we are here. Okay, let us not tell ourselves comforting lies or live by values we do not genuinely believe in. Okay, that point I really think is a little more similar to how I would interpret at least the broad strokes of Nietzsche's thought. It's about not lying to yourself, and it is also about deciding what values are really important to you. Instead, we should have the courage to face awful reality as it is and live authentically while we live. Sure, again, it's still a bit of an oversimplification, but there's something to that. Fair enough. Okay, so then in the next paragraph, Bachmann talks about Nietzsche's rejection of democracy and how he doesn't think that being nice is the solution. And then he presents a quote from Beyond Good and Evil to prove this point. Here's that quote. So this is Nietzsche now. "What bizarre distortions and lies people put up with. It never ceases to amaze anyone who has eyes to see. Oh, look, isn't everything around us so cheery and free, so easy and simple? Isn't it wonderful how we have given ourselves a free pass to experience everything that is superficial? And oh, how we have figured out from the dawn of time how to keep ourselves ignorant so that we might enjoy a degree of freedom and escape from care, feel ourselves to be brave and cheerful, and to actually enjoy existence." So he, in some sense, basically cherry picks a quote from Nietzsche where he is, what word would you use? He's being like kind of bursting our bubble, saying that we shouldn't live by superficial illusions that give us comfort. That's basically what that quote is. And there are lots of places in Nietzsche where he says stuff like that. What I'm getting here is that Bachmann is painting a picture of Nietzsche that, again, is a little bit bleak. There's some nuance there about how he's not himself a nihilist, etc. But I can't deny these are important points to raise about Nietzsche. He then talks about how Nietzsche rejects Christianity, and then he proceeds to also nuance that rejection, or that articulation of Nietzsche's rejection of Christianity. Quote, "Nietzsche was not as resolutely anti-Christian through most of his life, as most people think, etc., etc., etc. So in continuing to try to criticize Nietzsche, or not criticize, characterize Nietzsche, he says, regardless, reading Nietzsche is a visceral experience. He shouts, curses, and ridicules. He uses coarse language and offers ugly analogies. He aims to shock. This, I think, is another good characterization. A bit surface level, but, it is a cursory introduction, fair enough. Skipping a few lines down, he writes in a confrontational and emotional style. Very, very good. Again, skipping further down, he says, the only thing he being Nietzsche, recognizes as absolutely good are the desire for life and the urge to create. There is hope of an ennobling life with purpose, only in the instinctive human yearning to renew existence. So this is why it's a good thing I actually read what the textbook said, because if I was just going to ramble based on what I remembered from these passages, I would have been a bit unfair to Bachman's articulations, and I would have connected it more to that, painting a picture of the flavor of 20th century thought being based in relativism and nihilism. But he is, again, even if it's simple, even if it's a bit straightforward, I still think that he is painting like a, half decent picture of many of, not all of, but many of the feelings and sentiments that you'll encounter when encountering Nietzsche. Then he talks about the will to power and the Superman, or the Übermensch. Let me see if he does a good job of that. I know this is a bit, off the cuff, but maybe this style of making a video about this stuff will sort of be a little bit more accessible and down to earth as to what it's like to actually read and learn about this stuff, instead of me just sitting here quoting Wikipedia at you and going right into some complicated text. So he qualifies that the will to power, despite many aesthetic similarities to whatever would come in the 20th century with fascism and totalitarianism and militarism, he qualifies that Nietzsche himself was not supportive of those ideologies. True enough. But then he says, quote, by the will of power, he, Nietzsche, meant the creative drive or creativity. And I would say that's mostly true, but it's not just creativity like the artist's creativity. It's kind of like a living thing's will or wills, plural, to, it's called the will to power, right? Not the will to creativity, to asserting itself, right? And it doesn't necessarily have to manifest in violence. There might be a sense where a plant's will to power is the will to grow taller, but it's not just the plant's will. There's a part of the plant that has a will to find nutrients, and that part of the plant burrows deep into the soil with its roots. And then a different part of the plant is looking for, the rays of the sun, so it goes out into, growing taller. In a human, there's a part of the human that wants food, so that part of the human is has a will to food. And then a different part of the human wants social clout. And that part of the human might actually suppress the food part of the human, because maybe it's not polite to eat too much right now. So you're going to suppress that will to power in favor of a different will. Then you have your creative drive. You have your your sexual drives, your spiritual drives, all these different things that make up the human spirit. And they're all competing with each other. It's not just about political or physical will to power. Yeah, and then here I might question some of Bachman's articulations here, because then when he talks about the Übermensch, he says, quote, Nietzsche envisions a world in which those with the will to power would emerge as natural leaders, whether in politics, intellectual life, or art. It might not be completely wrong, but again, I don't think that's the point I would emphasize. Keep in mind, Nietzsche wrote a lot of works. I might be forgetting many of the passages that might impel Bachman to have said this. These supermen or Übermensch would do a better job of it than the general masses. Again, I don't think that's completely wrong. Nietzsche does, not like democracy, etc. But I don't think, at least from what I read, that's the main point of will to power. I'm not an expert on that part of Nietzsche, though. Let's move along. After a few more remarks, that's basically the subheading or the subchapter about Nietzsche completed. I'll just make note of the transitional sentence into the next subheading, which is called Logic and Language. And we won't go deep into this, but just to kind of give almost like a conclusion about how Bachmann is thinking about Nietzsche and this historical moment of which he's an important part. Quote, Western philosophers after Nietzsche had experienced the death of God and of classical physics. So again, he's connecting Nietzsche's influence and Nietzsche's intellectual insights to Einstein, basically. The relativism of Einstein's relativity, or his general relativity, mirrors, in many ways, Nietzsche's, perspectivism, or he doesn't use the word relativism to describe Nietzsche, but the words are kind of right next to each other there. The chapter before Nietzsche was about relativity, etc., etc. When I took a history class, we didn't use this textbook, but they still talked about Nietzsche and Einstein as part of like the same intellectual movement. The movement in the early 20th century of Western philosophy towards relativity or relativism. Again, as a means of trying to identify the broad strokes of what's going on across the whole culture. So it's going to be, a cartoonified picture. That's kind of the historian's job. So they being Nietzsche and Einstein, and actually the philosophers following Nietzsche, had witnessed the unnerving strangeness and relativity of the universe develop from a rarefied scientific theory to a general worldview. Okay, so now we're going to leave the textbook, The Cultures of the West, aside. Hopefully you learned something from that. Hopefully there's some cool insight there. I think there was. But to wrap this video up, I'm going to turn to a passage in Nietzsche that I remember really well, that I think starts to characterize where Nietzsche was coming from. And I'm basically going to position it as a supplemental way to nuance what Bachmann was saying. Basically, allowing for some nuance, he conceives of Nietzsche as intentionally or not bringing about or helping to bring about an era of relativity, also of despair, or what word does he use? Bleakness is the word he used. A key figure in the new bleakness was Friedrich Nietzsche, because the pillars and the values of, for example, Christendom and Enlightenment, hope and progress and rationalism, these things had been uprooted, basically. And though Nietzsche is not a nihilist himself, he's certainly, related to or talked about in the same breath as nihilism for many reasons. Maybe he's not a relativist himself, but the same thing with relativism, or at least perspectivism, often being compared to Nietzsche. Fine. But having read a lot of Nietzsche myself and, kind of had some fun with it, enjoyed it, struggled with it a fair bit, my assessment is that one of, if not, Nietzsche's most important concern is a concern with honesty. Honesty before truth. So in that way, he's not going to prioritize absolute truth in the same way that some people might. And there is a certain perspectivism in that, because if everyone is honest, they have different perspectives. So they are going to, each person's honesty is going to look different. But in one of Nietzsche's earlier books, Human All Too Human, which I don't think is his best book, it's not his most, developed or refined piece of writing. What it does, though, is, demonstrate his struggle or his effort to develop his philosophy, develop his thought. In the preface to Human All Too Human, again, I consider this as a place where Nietzsche is really concerned about developing the structure and the nature of his thought. This is actually in the first section of the preface. The preface is divided into a number of sections like the rest of the work. And he's telling us in some rather personally revealing and intense detail about his struggle to be honest in his writing. And so I'll read the paragraph that I'm talking about, or I'll actually start in the middle of the paragraph, and then we'll kind of talk about it and wrap this video up. So it's gonna start in the middle of a thought, but it'll make sense as we keep going here. Perhaps one could accuse me in this regard of some sort of, quote, art, various sorts of finer counterfeiting. For example, that I had deliberately and willfully closed my eyes to Schopenhauer's blind will to morality, at a time when I was already clear-sighted enough about morality. Similarly, that I had deceived myself about Richard Wagner's incurable romanticism, as if it were a beginning and not an end. Similarly about the Greeks, similarly about the Germans and their future, and there might be a whole long list of such similarities. Again, that's a bit out of context, so just to clarify, summarize, Nietzsche is saying, hey, here's a list of things that I wasn't clear-sighted about, or in his words, that I had, quote, deliberately and willfully closed my eyes to, right? So he's not being honest there. He's closing his eyes to all these really nerdy things. Wagner, Schopenhauer, the Germans' future. Hey, fair enough. From Nietzsche's perspective, maybe you do want to close your eyes to the Germans' future. Fair enough. But now I'm going to continue reading. But even if this all were true, and I were accused of it with good reason, what do you know, what could you know about the amount of self-preserving cunning, of reason and higher protection that is contained in such self-deception, and how much falseness I still require so that I may keep permitting myself the luxury of my truthfulness? Enough. I am still alive, and life has not been devised by morality. It wants deception. It lives on deception. But wouldn't you know it? Here I am, beginning again, doing what I have always done, the old immoralist and birdcatcher. I am speaking immorally, extra-morally, beyond good and evil. Okay, towards the end of that passage, he kind of starts talking about beyond good and evil. We'll leave that aside for now. But the key point here is that he is basically saying, I have to lie to myself a little bit, or maybe even a lot, to permit myself the quote, luxury of my truthfulness. And I interpret my truthfulness to be the thing with which he writes, right? He's in the preface here telling us what he's going to do, and in a large respect, what he's going to do is use his truthfulness. But in doing so, he's acknowledging, quote, life, quote, once deception, it lives on deception. This, I believe, is whether this is compatible with the concern of relativity or bleakness or whatever else or not. What he cares about is the fact that life is oriented, human life is oriented such that lying is essential to survival, to our desires. And throughout his work, he acknowledges that this is how it works. But a little bit ironically and contradictorily, Nietzsche is full of contradictions, despite the fact that he's basically kind of radically arguing that we love lies and we need lies. He's also talking about his truthfulness and his efforts to transcend his need to lie, even though, again, he's also saying that we do need to lie, so why would you try to transcend it? Especially when he's talking about amor fati, the love of fate, accepting things how they are, etc., etc. We won't go into that now. Some of Nietzsche's earlier essays, such as The Pathos of Truth, note that title, the feeling involved with our relationship to truth, and on truth and lies in a non-moral sense, even in those titles, you can start to figure out what he's concerned with. Namely, we lie often, maybe we tell the truth sometimes, but mostly we lie. And that is like baked into our survival needs and whatever else. And that's a big part, or at least a small part, it's at least a part of his critique of philosophy, which is apparently innocently interested in truth. Nietzsche says, no, nobody's innocently interested in truth, except apparently for him, to permit myself of my truthfulness, etc. Okay, I might have been rambling a bit. I'm still trying to learn how to present these, unscripted videos. But the key point here is that far from nihilism, far from the will to power or the Übermensch or critique of Christianity or whatever else might be popularly talked about with relation to Nietzsche, his relativism, his perspectivism, his similarity in the history of Western thought to whatever Einstein was doing, at least in, some way. Aside from all that, one of the key concerns of Nietzsche, one of the most important concerns of Nietzsche, in my opinion, is our emotional relationship to whether we tell the truth, to honesty. I think that if Nietzsche has an insight that we can take away and use, it's these kinds of insights in his writing. When we talk about science, when we talk about politics, when we talk about citing sources, misinformation, echo chambers, when we use all of that public discourse, and there's always some hint or rhetorical appeal to truth, check your sources, check your bias, whatever. Don't be a postmodern relativist. Understand God's objective truth. All of those rhetorical appeals to truth, a Nietzschean might be skeptical of because, as human beings, the reality is we don't like truth most of the time. Oftentimes, we don't need truth to operate. So, to what degree is it disingenuous, even for some scientists, to constantly be claiming that they have the favor of the truth, or they have the advantage of being innocently interested in the truth? Hopefully that gave you something to think about. I know this video might be a little bit longer than I intended it to be, and I'm just going to keep rolling with videos like this until I basically learn how to present this stuff in maybe a more cohesive manner. But I do hope that you got something out of that. And if you'd like to hear more about philosophy and world literature, I've got a main channel, a Patreon, and lots of other videos coming up about Goethe, Nietzsche, French literature, European philosophy, and world literature. I know that's a bit sporadic, but check out the links below. I hope there's something that interests you. And until next time, I hope you have a good day.